With the official confirmation from series producer Eiji Aonuma that all work on Breath of the Wild, the expansion pass, and all DLC packs has been concluded, and that the Zelda team has moved to working on the next entry, we decided to look back at what should be built upon from Breath of the Wild, brought back from previous installments, and abandoned from Breath of the Wild for future entries. It is a given with development on the next 3D Zelda game in its starting gates, won't be coming out anytime soon, but it's always exciting to think about what the next title could be like. All we know about this entry so far is that it'll maintain the open-air structure established by Breath of the Wild, as it revolutionized how we see open-world games. We already have a few things we would like the team to consider while developing this new game, and that's what we're going to go deep into in this final episode of Inside Breath of the Wild. In Breath of the Wild, Hyrule took center stage as a massive open air that changed how we perceive games in the open world genre, and the Great Plateau was the best tutorial area we have ever played. Thanks to a dynamic physics and chemistry engine, the world feels truly alive, with flora and fauna that behave realistically with one another. This engine is so revolutionary that it needs to be commonplace in future Zelda titles from now on, including the next one. Matter of fact, Nintendo could use the same exact engine for that game, significantly cutting down on development costs and time, similar to what was done with Majora's Mask and Super Mario Galaxy 2. It would be better than waiting another 5 to 6 years for another attempt to reinvent the wheel. The way of filling the map through the Sheikah Towers marked for a quest to learn your surroundings, and then after completing this first task, began searching for what the different provinces were hiding. This evolution of the Ubisoft Towers, where you are given a map without being pointed to quests and activities, should be built upon and expanded in future games. Hyrule itself was a living entity in Breath of the Wild, one that could guide you or kill you. One of the clearest examples of this organic experience was the sophisticated weather system, which should be built upon for the next Zelda game. But please make it rain a little less. If anything, add some more key collectibles that actually lead to a satisfying reward for completion. We're looking at you, Korok Seeds. And while you're at it, why can't all provinces stand out and not live in the shadow of the Champion and Divine Beast domains? Despite being filled with vast amounts of wildlife and enemies, there are still people and settlements in this post-apocalyptic environment. Settlements like Hateno and Kakariko villages offer glimmers of hope in an otherwise devastated Hyrule. However, the other races such as the Sheikah, Rito, Gorons, Zoras, and Gerudo thrive more so than the Hylians. In that regard, the next Zelda game should continue keeping the population diverse, but give the Hylians or another Hylian-like race a more central role in the next Zelda game. How can they do this? Simple. Don't make it post-apocalyptic. Before we knew any information about Breath of the Wild, we were really looking forward to seeing how Hyrule's castle town would be depicted. You can imagine our disappointment when we saw nothing but ash and rubble, and this wasn't improved after seeing the beginning of the final cutscene in the Champion's Ballad and the concept of a thriving market square in the Masterworks. On a personal note, we would love Zelda to go back and build on its high fantasy premise, and while you're at it, bring back massive explorable dark forests with creepy creatures. The closest we got to this in Breath of the Wild was the Lost Woods, which was nothing but a foggy linear maze leading straight to the Master Sword or shrines. What we are talking about is perhaps bring back a haunted province like Ikana in Majora's Mask. And yes, we had ruined Hyrule Castletown with the Guardians and some other smoked settlements. However, most of these did not feel haunting, but rather empty and depressing. We will get back to some of these nitpicks in the gameplay and story section, but we just have to ask this before we move on. Where were the re-deads in Breath of the Wild? With all that said, the Zelda team can at this point do one of two things with the overworld in the next game. One, stay in Hyrule but restore it to its former might, and secondly, go to a different land a la Termina in Majora's Mask or Koholint in Link's Awakening. With that being said, we doubt that Nintendo will pull another Great Sea, as the Great Sea in the Wind Waker was put in place because of system limitations, while still having an ambition to create a seamless experience. Two things. Malice, now that Calamity Ganon's reign of terror has ended, though it might be replaced with something else, and as previously mentioned, overuse of rain when you are about to climb anything in Hyrule. The Zelda team took many creative risks with Breath of the Wild. One of the greatest and most successful were tied to its gameplay. First and foremost, no longer is the gameplay confined to a few key items and linear exploration. Instead, Zelda has become the staple of exploration, survival, and in a large extent, combat. Let us explain. From the beginning at the Great Plateau, you are given all the necessary tools within the first hour. A jump button, ability to cook, climb and shield surf, pick up and break any weapon, and bend the world to your will through the use of the 4 Sheikah runes, Magnesis, Remote Bomb, Stasis, and Cryonis. Then, after getting the approval from King Rome, gliding your way down to Hyrule Kingdom. This formula could return in the future, even though we have a sad feeling that if the next 3D Zelda isn't a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild, then we will most likely not see the runes again. That, or the runes we know with granted additions, will permanently replace a number of traditional items from the Zelda series.
Needless to say, we are 100% certain that the physics and chemistry engine found in Breath of the Wild, along with climbing and gliding, will in some form be reused for future Zelda titles, as we believe that this will become a series staple from this point onward. Combined, the physics and chemistry engine, weather system, wildlife, cooking system, weapon durability, climbing, gliding, and the Sheikah runes changed how we approach and play Zelda. They force us to think before we act, strategize, and combine to bring the surrounding elements to our advantage. If anything, Breath of the Wild made us for the first time in a long while think how we approach and prepare for combat, from the complex sound and stealth mechanics to armor, special dishes, and finally weaponry. The weapon durability implemented in the game is controversial to many, but was a necessary move to keep us away from using the same item or weapon for most of the game until you obviously pull the Master Sword. As such, we believe that a more balanced weapon durability system will return in future Zelda games to take advantage of the greatly extended and incredibly diverse arsenal of weapons and shields found throughout Hyrule in Breath of the Wild. It was a needed change for the Zelda franchise and makes it stand out to games like Skyrim or Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Otherwise, we just want to point out that there are so many introductions that should be kept that we simply have no chance to reference them all in this video. But if possible, we would love to see ancient Sheikah tech stay in future installments. In Breath of the Wild there were almost no boundaries on land and in the sky, but one boundary was re-established, and that was through lack of underwater exploration, even with the Zora armor. A gameplay mechanic that has been seen in all 3D Zeldas with exception of the Wind Waker and now Breath of the Wild. The reason for the need of a re-implementation is that Breath of the Wild had a beautiful overworld, but with large sections of it were completely underutilized compared to past entries, such as Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess, where heart pieces could even be found underwater. Speaking of, heart pieces found in the overworld should return to some extent, but not placed in some random locations, but rather be tied to character quests, similar to how you solve the cast shrine and side quests. And speaking of traditional Zelda, we would also like to see a more traditional soundtrack and use of this one. A few more items and enemies return. You know, like in Majora's Mask, we had an optional hookshot. And in terms of enemies, bring back a great variety, including the Darknuts, Iron Knuckles, Redeads, Poes, Dekubabas, Skulltulas, and finally Floor and Wall Masters. All of these were absent in Breath of the Wild. Of course, they should return and be found in dungeons.
Dungeons are a staple of the Legend of Zelda series. In Breath of the Wild, if you can call them that, they came in the form of the Divine Beasts. These mechanical titans are completed by activating terminals locked behind physics-based puzzles. Yes, they are much different and less linear than traditional Zelda dungeons, but if you cease to compare them, the Divine Beasts could have fit in Breath of the Wild as intro dungeons, like the Great Deku Tree, Dodongo's Cavern, and Jabu Jabu's Belly from Ocarina of Time. But let's face it, Woodfall, Snowhead, Great Bay, and Stone Tower temples, they are not. We'll get back to explain how the Divine Beasts could work better in a future game alongside dungeons, but first we need to remember that Breath of the Wild also had shrines, which acted as warping points, mini dungeons with puzzles, combat trials, and shrine quests in the open world. If shrines do come back in the next Zelda game, there should be a better balance between them and actual dungeons. There are only 4 main dungeons, 5 if you count Hyrule Castle, and 120 shrines that rewarded you with spirit orbs to increase your health or stamina. Better yet, with fewer numbers of shrines, they could be longer and have their own distinct visual themes rather than looking all the same. And now back to the big elephant in the room. Since, let's be real, Zelda games are known best for their dungeons. Even in the most unimpressive Zelda games, you can almost guarantee that the dungeons were incredible. The same cannot be said for Breath of the Wild. While just about everything else was amazing, the Divine Beast dungeons were nothing close to what we expect from a Zelda game. They were short, all looked the same, had the same bosses, and very few enemies within them. It is an absolute must that the traditional dungeon designs of previous Zelda games need to return. Honestly, it's one thing to have a great open world, and Breath of the Wild definitely has that, but that is commonplace in most fantasy games these days. What separates Zelda from the rest of them are the dungeons, and what we saw in Breath of the Wild wasn't what we wanted. Though how could they bring back traditional dungeons without making all of them too linear and secure an interesting variety of dungeons in terms of themes, length, and linearity/non-linearity? One is obviously to bring back the traditional linear dungeons, while building upon the non-linear staple set in Breath of the Wild. Take a look at Hyrule Castle. It set the perfect groundwork for how an open-ended Zelda dungeon could be. You should be able to explore the dungeons at your own pace, while taking your own routes, then be on a guided path. They should be non-linear in nature, but to get to specific places, you'll need to get the right keys and do the right puzzles. The order you tackle them, however, is completely up to you. Like we stated before, dungeons like the Divine Beasts could serve as good intro dungeons, but should not be the only ones. Simply put, get rid of the short lengths, get rid of only one theme, and bring in several, and for Hylia's sake, don't make them all end on the same boss. Breath of the Wild is one of the greatest Zelda games ever made, but just imagine how much better it would have been with real dungeons. Bosses are another staple in the Zelda franchise, and Breath of the Wild had quite a few, though it admittedly is not the best example of it. But since we're talking about what should stay, the overworld bosses should be one of them. From the Hinoxes, Guardians, Stone Taluses, and more, Hyrule is not short of its threats. This should return in the next Zelda game, but maybe with more variety. Also, if there was anything to take away from the Champions Ballad DLC, it's the Monk Maz Koshia boss fight. It was clever, challenging, and fun. No doubt the best boss battle in the entire game. More like these, please. This is yet another one of those times where the next Zelda game needs to not learn from Breath of the Wild, but the other entries. Bosses were another field Breath of the Wild suffered in, most notably the dungeon bosses, which were all puppet Ganons. Even though they had different powers and slightly different looks, they still looked and behaved the same. What happened to legendary bosses like Golma, Stalord, and Phantom Ganon? Not to mention these bosses used the environment to their advantage in more creative ways than the puppets. It would be cool to see some returning bosses, but they should also focus on giving us new ones as well. Ones that are more interesting than the puppet Ganons. You've probably already figured this out, but we seriously don't like the puppet Ganons at the end of each Divine Beast. They aren't bad per se, but when you compare them to other bosses in the Zelda universe, there's just no contest. They all bear strikingly similar looks and don't have any remotely interesting powers. Okay, Thunderblight Ganon's speed was pretty cool, but that's it. However, the puppet Ganons aren't the biggest offense of Breath of the Wild. It is Calamity Ganon himself. Here we have a beast that was built up from the beginning to be a true terror, a malevolent force of nature that destroyed most of Hyrule, killed all of the champions, corrupted all of the guardians and divine beasts, and you kill him through target practice. After you beat his odd-looking spider form phase, you're sent out to Hyrule Field to take him out Dark Beast style, and all you have to do is shoot massive targets on his back. That's it. The first phase isn't that hard either, especially after you cut his health in half from the divine beasts. The final boss of Calamity Ganon was, in a word, disgraceful, and it is not the epic conclusion that we've been conditioned to expect from a Zelda game. So, here are our words of advice to the development team. Don't do that. Story is not as important in Zelda as the previous conventions we talked about, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be there. Just watch our 1 hour long Zelda timeline video and you will know that it does matter to create purpose in the world of Hyrule. Since it's much more motivating to save Hyrule if you care about the people who inhabit it. Breath of the Wild took this a step further and finally brought voice acting into the series, albeit very slowly and mostly to describe past events and legends. Voice acting should definitely return in the next Zelda game, but make it better. If a character is supposed to have a British accent, actually cast someone who's British. Then there is a case of the story's progression. After you're done with the Great Plateau, you're free to tackle whatever you want, whenever you want. The same goes with the story. Don't feel like visiting Impa and Kakariko Village? No need to. Don't care at all about the memories? Forget them. Want to go straight to the final boss after the plateau? Good luck. The non-linear progression can be impressive at times, but the quality of the story kind of suffered as a result. Most of the game revolves around what happened 100 years ago in the event of the Great Calamity, so there isn't a whole lot happening in the present day. The fact that most of the cutscenes take place 100 years ago says everything. In the next game, some of the linearity from previous Zeldas should make a return, but not all of it. A perfect balance should be struck in order to give players the freedom to tackle anything in the order they want, while also having enough constraint to tell an intriguing story. A way to do this could be to have smaller, unlinear quests build up to a linear conclusion. Say a dungeon, or unlocking a path to the final dungeon by assembling a team of mercenaries. It doesn't matter in what order you assemble the team, the most important thing is that you fill the quota up so you can face the challenges ahead. And please bring back some high fantasy themes in this next Zelda game, the series would benefit so much from it. First and foremost, the memories. One non-linear amnesia quest is enough. Next, the Zelda game needs to learn from Breath of the Wild and not have an underdeveloped villain. We stated in the boss section that Calamity Ganon and even more Dark Beast Ganon were a complete joke for a decisive battle. But he was also a complete joke as a character. Sure, he had tact and succeeded in devastating most of Hyrule, but other than that, he didn't give us any real reason to hate him. No desire to deliver a crushing blow to his head. So for the next Zelda game, which we suspect might not even have Ganon, the antagonist needs to be a truly menacing foe. Someone that makes things personal. Take a look at Zant and Girahim. they were actually interacting with Link before any real battle occurred. So when you finally took them on, it felt important. They would also take something from Link that would actively make his journey more difficult. If there's one thing the villain for the next Zelda game needs, it's personality. And that is pretty much it. To be honest, most of the points we have brought up here about returning elements will doubtfully happen, as after Breath of the Wild, the Zelda team will most likely never go back to the traditional Zelda gameplay. And the same goes for the Zelda franchise. It has evolved after Breath of the Wild, but that doesn't mean it can't become richer in content, lore, or themes. And gladly, director Hidemaru Fujibayashi has confirmed that he has many unused ideas left for the next Zelda title.
Thank you so much for 3 years of continuous support on our Breath of the Wild series. First with Zelda Unknown for 3 seasons from 2015 to 2016, and then 2 seasons of Inside the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild from June 2016 to January 2018. And does this mean the end of Zelda content on the channel? No, far, far from it. Because we have big plans for Zelda content on the channel. We have the game versus game of Breath of the Wild versus Majora's Mask, which you have demanded for quite some time already, and we are very much looking forward to making that our first duel of the year. And we will be doing Zelda theories, we will be doing news coverage, especially now that we are in the 20th anniversary of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, so if there are any remakes or at least some special releases of Ocarina of Time, we will definitely report on that. And we also know that Skyward Sword, since the Switch has motion controls, is bound to happen, a remake, at some point in the Switch's life cycle, so we'll definitely be there reporting as well. In addition, we'll be doing also Zelda opinion pieces, and finally have episodes regarding Zelda games in our brand new series, which will be premiering later this month. But this isn't completely the end of Inside Breath of the Wild, since we'll have a bonus episode including all the best ideas from you, the viewers. And we collected those, and that video will probably go up in, say, a week from now. But for now, at least, that is the final normal episode of Inside the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. We hope you enjoyed it, so give it a like, subscribe if you are new, and of course, we also wanted to commemorate this final episode by launching 2 special t-shirts. One is very closely tied to Inside Zelda Breath of the Wild, which includes Link from Breath of the Wild on horseback with the Master Sword. We got a beautiful silhouette made by RC Omni, taken straight from our channel logo. And we also have a t-shirt featuring this beautiful lion here, holding the SNES controller. So a link is in the description down below. We also want to thank all our gracious patrons, especially royal producer Kenyatta Ali, for continuous support of the channel and of course this series and any future Zelda content and videos on this channel. So until the next Zelda video on the channel, guys, this has been the Commonwealth Realm, and we will see you girls and guys soon.